Hello and welcome to our special series on FP Live, America Votes, What It Means for the World. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy. Today's episode is focused on Europe. Of all the areas Donald Trump and Kamala Harris disagree on foreign policy, the transatlantic relationship is probably the number one issue or region where there are significant differences. Trump has threatened to pull out of NATO. Harris served in an administration that was clearly pro-NATO. Harris has called Russia's Putin a murderous dictator. Trump's views, decidedly less clear. But more broadly, Trump can be seen as transactional. The Harris worldview, we think, is decidedly more values-based and might hinge on alliances. It's worth passing all of that through with some experts, and I have two terrific ones for you today. Nathalie Tocci is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, and Mark Leonard is the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Two great think tanks, two great minds. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great being here.
It's great to have you on. So, Nathalie, I think I'll begin with you, and I want to start with the war between Russia and Ukraine. How would the Trump and Harris presidencies impact the war?
Firstly, let me say, Ravi, that I think that in both scenarios, because indeed, we tend to concentrate a lot on the differences, but I think in both scenarios, you were looking at essentially either it's an abrupt or a gradual US disengagement, I would say, from European security more broadly, and obviously specifically on Ukraine. And so in both scenarios, we're basically in the ballgame of Europeans taking on greater responsibility when it comes to their own security, beginning with dealing with the war on their continent, which of course, as of now, is in Ukraine. And I say this because this is actually not the story post-November. This has been the story over the last year and a half. In fact, whereas at the beginning of the war, essentially the United States did 90% of the work on Ukraine, particularly in military terms. Now we're in the sort of 50-50, right, area. And if you, sort of add onto it the economic as well as the military, obviously that percentage grows. And it will grow. And let me add, it should grow, right? Because this is a European problem. It's a European war. And it's only fair that Europeans should be mainly dealing with it. So the main differences between the two are, I think, in the mode through which this US gradual or not gradual disengagement take place, and indeed connected to this in the timing. So in the case of a return of Donald Trump to the White House, we are likely to see an abrupt change, a lack of coordination with Europeans. You can imagine that even before Trump returns to the White House, there could be that phone call between Vova and Donald, which basically, without obviously consulting either Europeans or Ukrainians, for that matter, essentially throwing Ukrainians under the bus, and Europeans kind of, would be left sort of wondering what and how to react to this. In the event of a Harris administration, you could imagine a lot more coordination, and so you could imagine a lot more gradualism. But I think it's important to note, and I think it's important that Europeans understand, I think to an extent they do understand, that actually in both scenarios, we're thinking and talking about an increasing European responsibility when it comes to Ukraine.
Mm. Mark, Bob Woodward's new book, War, has some explosive revelations, and we just talked about Trump throwing Ukraine under the bus. We can't confirm this ourselves, and the Trump campaign does deny everything that's in the book. But Woodward revealed that Trump took 7 phone calls with Putin since leaving office in 2021. How is that being received in Europe?
Well, most Europeans are very scared of a Trump presidency for all sorts of reasons, which we'll talk about as we go into the conversation. But right at the top of the list for many member states is this question of Ukraine, because though the US has obviously been struggling to get appropriation bills through Congress, and it seems quite clear that even if Biden had stayed on as president, that he would be loath to spend a lot of time trying to get big appropriation bills through Congress. There is a world of difference between what Trump and his surrogates have been saying about Ukraine from what the Harris team have been saying. And at the core of the Trump peace plan, the idea that he will solve it within 24 hours is an idea that he will talk to the Russians. And it's not just that he'll throw Ukraine under the bus by withdrawing military support for Ukraine. It's also that he seems to have a different idea about how the situation gets solved. There's a lot of focus on the sort of territorial integrity of Ukraine and whether that is given up on. But actually, from a European perspective, that's not even the biggest threat. If you look at the Russian war aims, they both have territorial claims on Ukraine, but they also want Ukraine to be neutral and to be shut out of NATO and out of the European Union. And they want it to be demilitarized. And it's quite possible that a Trump peace plan will not just be about settling and freezing the conflict where it is at the moment, with Russia being able to keep hold of the parts of Ukraine that it already controls. But it's also, given his extreme skepticism about NATO, it's unlikely that he's going to be an advocate for Ukraine joining NATO. And even if it did, and we'll talk probably more about NATO in the future, it's not entirely clear how much NATO membership is worth if Trump is posing big questions about Article 5 and moving towards a more dormant NATO. Whereas from an EU perspective, if there is a resolution to the conflict, the most important thing is going to be to make sure that there is some sort of long-term future for Ukraine as an independent democracy that can be part of the West, that can, it's a candidate country now for the European Union. Most Ukrainians want to be in NATO one day, and it's quite clear that unless Ukraine has really solid security guarantees, even if there is a freeze in the war next year, it might not last very long if Ukraine is demilitarized and there aren't kind of solid security guarantees either by joining NATO or having sort of bilateral equivalents or mini-lateral equivalents with different countries. And that's why I think, within the Biden administration, in the kind of Harris camp, there are informal talks about different scenarios. One idea that seems to be gaining traction is the sort of West German model, the idea that Ukraine might somehow be allowed into NATO and be given security guarantees for the parts of the country that it controls, if there is any kind of settlement, if not for the whole country. And those things seem very unlikely to materialize under a Trump peace plan. So I think that could be quite a significant difference. And from a European perspective, I think makes the difference between, a kind of short-term pause in fighting, which could give Russia a chance to regroup and then launch another wave of attack, not just on Ukraine, but on other countries. And the idea that, you might have some sort of long-term security for Ukraine, which would allow the country to rebuild and to have a future as a democracy and as a country that has some sort of control over its future geopolitical direction. And from an EU and European perspective, that question is as important as the amount of territory that the government in Kyiv controls.